Hi, I'm Momona Tamada. I play Claudia Kishi on the Netflix series The Babysitter's Club, and today I'm excited to read you a passage from Claudia and the Phantom Phone Calls by Anna Martin. Late that afternoon, Christy and I began one of our most terrifying babysitting experiences ever. Jamie Newton's mother had called 2 weeks earlier, needing a sitter for that evening. There was one hitch. Jamie would not be the only child with the Newtons. His wild cousins would be there too. I'd babysat for them once before, by myself, and based on that experience, I told Mrs. Newton she would need 2 sitters the second time, especially since the job was over dinner hour and the kids would need to be fed. Jamie's cousins were Rob, Brenda, and Rosie. Rob, the oldest, was 8, Brenda was 5, and Rosie was 3. They were all tough to handle. Rob hated girls, including girl babysitters. Brenda was fussy, and Rosie was noisy. Well, they were all noisy. The other time I'd sat for them, they jumped and ran around the living room and disobeyed practically everything I said. I'd finally managed to calm them down, but I still wasn't looking forward to the evening, although it was bound to be different with Christy there. We arrived at the Newtons at 5 o'clock and found the place already in chaos. The adults, Jamie's parents, and Mr. and Mrs. Feldman, the parents of Rob, Brenda, and Rosie, were all trying to get ready to leave. But 3 of the 4 kids, all but Rob, were crying. Mrs. Feldman couldn't find the sandwiches she brought for her supper, and Mrs. Newton suddenly discovered that her good coat wouldn't button around her middle anymore. "Darn," she said, "I wore this coat the entire time I was pregnant with Jamie. I just don't understand it." "Sis," called Miss Feldman from the kitchen, "the sandwiches are absolutely not in the refrigerator. If they are, they're invisible." "Rosie, stop it. I don't know why Brenda hit you." "Not that refrigerator. I put them in the one in the basement," Mrs. Newton called back. "Get Jamie to show you." "What am I going to wear tonight? I can't wear this awful maternity coat, not to this cocktail party." "Roger," she shouted upstairs to Mr. Newton. "Mommy," Jamie came sniffling into the hall and pulled on his mother's hand. "I don't want to go into the basement with Aunt Diane." "Never mind, sis, I found them." "Brenda, stop it. You're pestering your sister." Well, things went on that way for about 5 more minutes, but finally Mrs. Newton found a shawl to wear instead of the coat, and miraculously, Jamie, Brenda, and Rosie stopped crying. The adults left. Christy and I looked at each other, and then the living room where the 4 kids were standing. They eyed us, and we eyed them. Rob gathered his sisters in a huddle while Jamie looked on. Suddenly, the huddle broke, and the Feldmans began tearing and screaming and jumping around, just as they had done when I had sat for them before. That time I had ignored them, and after a while they had quieted down. But Christy had a different idea. You have to remember that even though she's small for her age, she's a tomboy, and she's used to boys and a big family. The Feldmans hadn't been screeching and tearing through the living room for more than 3 seconds when Christy put her fingers in her mouth and blew hard. An ear-piercing whistle screamed from her lips. The Feldmans stopped cold. "Now hear this," shouted Christy. "No yelling, no running, and no jumping inside this house." And I meant it. She saw that Rob was about to say something, so she added, "One false move and I'll punch your lights out. That goes for all of you. Do you hear me?" The Feldmans nodded. Jamie was wide-eyed with disbelief at what his beloved Christy had just said. "Do you understand me?" she went on. The Feldmans nodded. "Any questions?" Rob started to open his mouth again and had thought better of it and raised his hand instead. "Yes," said Christy. "How did you do that?" "Do what?" "Whistle with your fingers." "Oh, here, I'll show you. But if you learn how to do it, remember that this is usually an outdoor whistle and not an indoor one. Got it?" "Yes." Christy took Rob into the basement for whistle practice, and I led the 3 younger children into the rec room and had just settled them into one of Jamie's favorite activities, coloring pictures of monsters, when the phone rang. "I'll get it," I called down to Christy. I dashed into the kitchen. "Hello, Newton's residence." Nothing. I couldn't hear a sound. "Hello?" I tried again. It's funny how sometimes you can be just as scared by nothing as by something. My hands were shaking when I hung up the receiver. "Who was it?" called Christy. "Wrong number," I replied uneasily. I didn't want to frighten any of the kids, but considering what had happened to the Goldmans the night before, I suddenly thought I had a good reason to be nervous. As soon as possible, I would tell Christy about the call in private. A half an hour later, as I was just beginning to think about supper, the phone rang again. Christy was coming up the stairs with Rob, who looked very proud of himself. "I'll get the phone this time," she said. I nodded and followed her into the kitchen. "Hello," she said. "Hello?" I could tell immediately that it was another one of those calls. Christy hung up the phone, looking nervous. I glanced into the rec room to make sure all the kids were busy. "No one there?" I asked Christy. She shook her head. "The first call was like that too. It wasn't really a wrong number." Christy bit her lip. "What do you think?" she whispered. "Is it time for the phantom to strike again?" I shrugged. "Do you think it could be Sam Goof calling?" Christy's brother had quite a reputation, and he'd like to give the Babysitters Club a hard time every now and then. "It's possible," she said Christy thoughtfully. "She's pretty interested in this phantom business, but it's not like Sam to call and not say anything. He kind of likes to leave his mark, if you know what I mean. It'd be more like him to get on the phone and say in a really spooky voice, 'Ooh, Christy, phantom here. Ooh, you better hide your plastic ring and your charm necklace because I'm on my way over.'" I smiled in spite of things. "Well, look, if it's the phantom, we're safe because he probably won't rob the house if someone's in it. He might. He has before. Besides, we're just kids. Maybe he can't figure out anything. He doesn't know whether any adults are home. Just because we answered the phone doesn't mean..." And at that wonderful moment, the phone rang a third time. I snatched it up, saying, "Hello, hello," and then on inspiration, I shouted into the kitchen, "Hey, Dad, I think it's another funny call. I think..." The caller hung up before I could even finish. "I think we better call the police." I smiled nervously at Christy as I put the receiver down. She smiled nervously back at me. "Well," she said briskly, "I'll start supper. I bet the kids are hungry." "Anyone want dinner?" I called into the rec room. Peace was still reigning there. I almost hated to disrupt it, but one of our responsibilities as babysitters that night was to feed Jamie and the Feldmans. "Starving!" Rob shouted, jumping up. "Yes!" chorused the others. They dropped their crayons and ran. "Whoa!" I said. Everyone back in the rec room and put the crayons and paper away. "I wasn't coloring," said Rob. "You can set the table then," I told him. "All right," he agreed cheerfully. A little while later, the table was set. Mrs. Feldman's sandwiches were stacked up on a plate in the middle, the glasses were filled with milk, and Christy and I were passing around apples and oranges. It was a simple dinner, and everyone, including Christy and me, seemed happy with it. In fact, we were so happy that for a few minutes we ate in silence. All I could hear were the crunchings and munchings and Jamie gulping down his milk. And a little bang from outside. My eyes met Christy's over the top of our tuna fish sandwiches. "Did you hear anything?" I asked her silently. "Did you hear something?" Rob asked at that moment. "Oh, probably just the wind," I replied, but my voice was shaking. "There's no wind tonight," he said. Another bang, not too loud. "There it is again," he said. "Maybe some dog is in one of the trash cans," suggested Christy. "Uncle Roger's trash cans are plastic." "Well," I said bravely, "I'll just go check on things." But I hadn't gotten any farther than the living room, with Christy and Rob at my heels, when we distinctly heard noises at one of the front windows and saw a shadow dart away into the falling darkness. "That does it," I said, suddenly more angry than frightened. "I'm going to call the police." And I did.